Hey guys, my name is Mannequin. Welcome back to EDM Pro Tips. Today's video is going to be friggin' short, and that's because the topic of audio interfaces in terms of upgrading and stuff like that is really stinking easy to cover. Unlike the previous ones, this isn't something that's actually supposed to be like extremely important in terms of sound quality. You don't need to worry about the sound and like whether or not it comes out colored or changed or trying to find the perfect thing to mix with. In terms of audio interfaces, you pretty much just want something that just works. And I don't mean just works as in does the job. Works as in there's a standard, and pretty much all companies out there that sell something, I'll list a whole bunch of brands later, but pretty much all of them that sell it have met that standard. So there's no real big deal about choosing one over the other because of sound quality or tone or anything like that, because pretty much they're all going to have the same sound quality and tone. So without further ado, what are audio interfaces and why do they matter? Why am I talking about them if they're so easy, and everything in between? So audio interfaces are basically a way to get audio from your computer. So essentially, you know your headphone jack. You could plug in headphones, and if you get the right adapters, you can plug them into studio monitors as well. But we tend not to like to use those, us producers, just because what can happen is the headphone preamp can do two things. First of all, it can be a poor preamp, and it won't be able to drive headphones well enough. And also what it can do is it can cause issues with some powered studio monitors that are expecting a different type of signal. And if you run that that output from your headphone jack, then it could run at a basically at a higher level than it's expecting, and it can cause some distortion. But that's not as often a case nowadays, although it is something you kind of need to be a little bit wary of. So we buy audio interfaces to basically take a USB port on our computer and turn it into high quality audio input and output. So essentially what you'll find on most audio interfaces, you'll find USB, which is where it connects to your computer. Then you'll find some sort of audio output, which is usually TRS, which is that stands for tip ring sleeve, which is basically like the 1/4-inch jacks. And sometimes, depending on which one you buy, you'll also find XLR, which are they're shaped round, and they have 3 prongs. Those ones are used more for microphones, but they're also used for some speakers, and it just kind of depends which one you get. And then, so that's kind of what you'll find on the back. On the front, you'll find a couple knobs and buttons, and then you'll find inputs, where you could put like a guitar, a microphone, or stuff like that. So, by way what to look for, it's really easy. How many inputs do you need, and what kind of outputs do you need? And it really just narrows down to that. Because like I said, sound quality between the different brands it's pretty much the same. You don't really have to worry about getting something that's bad when you're choosing any of the brands. And in fact, if you got 2 brands and someone said, someone did a blind test and told you, okay, tell me which one is which, you probably wouldn't even be able to tell there was a difference. Just because audio interfaces nowadays have just gotten to the point to where they're basically they're really good, and it's hard to get better. Just because unlike speakers, you're not actually creating sound. It's a lot of, this process is a lot more mathematical, and you're just taking the digital input that the little interface receives, and then you're going to turn it into some sort of basically a changing output that actually can, drive a headphone or a speaker or something like that. And similarly, you're just translating the input into digital for your computer to figure it out. So, so it's very mathematical. It's kind of like, buying different quality of cables. Like, you have to be really, really, really worried about your sound to like buy, $500 cables. That's an over exaggeration, but like buying expensive cables versus just normal cables, most of the time you won't hear a difference. That said, sometimes you'll buy a really crappy cable and it'll actually have issues, and then you'll need to replace it with a better one. But there's usually not like a difference between quality of cables. And basically the way to put it is, ways like a while back, they really didn't have high quality cables. They just had cables. And essentially, there were found some problems with the cables, and they improved them. But other than that, there's not really such thing as like, metal that'll transfer the sound and make it sound better. It's pretty much always just going to be, uniform. A cable is a cable. That's the same kind of idea with the digital audio interface. It's basically just a little translating box that goes from analog, which is kind of generally what electricity runs on, to digital, which is what computers use. And what I mean by what electricity runs on is like when you turn up the volume on your speakers, you're just providing it more energy. And that's the way sound kind of works too. It's like when you're moving your speaker, you're just providing the speaker more energy, more or less, and it creates the movement. So all it's doing, all the audio interface is doing, is translating between it. So this is where I give a warning, though. You might be tempted to get a $300 audio interface, but I'm going to tell you right now, you probably don't need that. There is a few circumstances which you might need that, but they're very few and far between. So I'm just going to kind of outline what you'll probably need, and then I'll go into the various situations where you might need more. So most of the audio interfaces that I'm going to kind of talk about are actually going to be $100 to $150, just because that's generally where they're at. Sometimes you get them as low as $60, although more likely around the $80 to $100 range. So what are you looking for? Essentially, if you want to ever record anything, you need to make sure that it has a couple inputs. And pretty much you can't buy an audio interface without inputs. So you don't need to worry about, getting an audio interface and not having microphone input. Just because pretty much every single one has one. There's also a thing called phantom power, which you will need if you want to use a condenser microphone, which is more often used for recording vocals and guitars and stuff, like acoustic guitars. But you don't have to worry about that again, because pretty much every audio interface from a reputable brand has phantom power. So you don't need to worry about that one. So basically, if you're going to record, you just need one or two inputs on the front of it so you can record. Now, that said, you might think, okay, well, I need at least two inputs because I'm going to record vocals and guitar. Yes and no. Actually, there's a way we do it in the recording field. We tend to actually record things separately. Why? Because it minimizes bleeding. So what we usually do is maybe we'll have, maybe we'll do like a rough recording where you have the artist record the guitar and the vocals at the same time. You just place the microphone a little bit farther away. And they do that, and then what you do is you run that to their headphones, and then they re-record the guitar, and then they take that recording of the guitar that they now have and run that through their headphones again, and then they record the vocals. So we have them separately, but at the same time they're all kind of, so they're separate in different tracks, but we don't have the bleed to where you're having a microphone here and a microphone here, one for the vocals, one for the guitar, and then you have to worry about the fact that you could kind of hear the guitar in the vocal microphone, and you kind of hear the vocals in the guitar microphone. So, so really you might think, oh, well, I need at least two, so I could do vocals and guitar at the same time. But you might not, just because the way we kind of do it to minimize bleeding is to actually record them separately. So that just goes to show that you probably don't need 7 or 8 inputs as well. Now, if you are going to be someone that's recording a band, then you might want more, but I'll talk about that later. So next thing is, after we talked about inputs here, just kind of, you need to make sure there's some inputs that you could use. And also, one thing I did want to note about the inputs is, nowadays, so I talked about XLR and TRS. You should be able to find, just Google images of those. You'll be able to find it. It'll be really easy. But you'll notice that some audio interfaces only have what looks like a XLR input. But if you look closely, they have a hole in the middle. That's actually a combo input where you could actually put a TRS plug into it or an XLR. So if you think it doesn't have one, just check for that hole in the center. If there's a hole in the center of the XLR input, then you could put both in. So so then you actually might not have to worry about that. Okay, but anyway, on to outputs. What outputs do you need? Now, this depends on a couple of factors. First of all, pretty much every single one you find is going to have a headphone output. So you don't need to worry about having one that has headphones and studio monitors. They pretty much all do. So that brings rise to the question, what kind of inputs do my monitors have? Because if your monitors have only XLR or only TRS, you want to make sure that either A, that audio interface has the appropriate connection, or B, you buy an adapter cable. Adapter cables usually won't affect the quality all that much, especially if you have TRS and you go to XLR. If you go from what's called a unbalanced TRS, which is, it's going to be hard to kind of talk about, But essentially, if you count the number of rings on TRS, there are two strips around a TRS jack, and a regular mono or unbalanced jack has only one strip around it. That's the way to tell without going into the technical details of the difference between the two. You kind of want to just get a TRS one, the one with the two strips around it, just so that, you know, because that one is kind of like, it's backwards compatible, but the one with only one strip it can only go so far. So so just kind of shoot for that. But anyway, with outputs, usually my suggestion is just make sure the audio interface you buy has the same connection, because then you don't have to worry about adapters. But otherwise, there are cable adapters out there as well, so you get like TRS to XLR and just connect that from your audio interface to your studio monitors. So then that brings rise to another question. How many studio monitors do you have? Now you might think to yourself right off the bat, well, I only have one pair. Do you also have computer speakers? Because in my case, I actually have a pair of computer speakers that are terrible, but they do work wonders at showing you where a mix has gone bad. So basically, if you listen on these terrible speakers, if you have a good mix, then your mix will actually sound okay through the speakers. But if you have a bad mix, it'll sound just horrid through those speakers. So it makes it really obvious. So I kind of have these crappy computer speakers, and I have my monitors. So I might want those extra inputs, or not extra inputs, extra outputs, so I could connect both at the same time, and I just have my studio monitors on when I need those, and then when I want to switch the computer speakers, I just turn off my monitors, and then I turn on my computer speakers, and I don't have to worry about changing the output audio device and making sure that's all lined up. So so that's just kind of my suggestion. Most of the time, you don't have to worry about having multiple outputs, though. And this is kind of where I transition into how many inputs and outputs do you need, and how will you ever know if you will need them in the future. But kind of, you need to just focus on the fact that you don't need that much. So you could get away with, like I said, one input and two outputs. Sometimes they're labeled weird. Like, you'll notice everything is kind of a multiple of two. So if something has two inputs and two outputs, that might mean it has two mono inputs and two mono outputs. Or sometimes it means it has two stereo inputs and two mono outputs. It's kind of confusing the way they run it, but just realize if you're getting something that's like $100, it's gonna basically have a microphone and like basically two inputs, one for like a microphone, one for a guitar, and then two outputs, one for each speaker. Not two outputs, one for each set of monitors, but actually one for each speaker. So it's kind of confusing in that regard. But anyway, what are the situations to where you'd want to get something better? And it's very uncommon that you would want to get something better. Well, not that you would want to get something better. So it's very common that you would want to get something better. It's very uncommon that you would need to get something better. The reason is because essentially the only time you would need multiple inputs is if you line in a whole bunch of different things at the same time, and you need to do it at the same time. One example of this is if you're recording full bands. So if you're going to be recording full bands, you want to make sure that you have enough inputs to do that. But keep in mind that audio interface is not going to be the biggest thing you're going to be worried about when it comes to that, because you're going to need to buy a lot of microphones to run into all those inputs at the same time. And that gets bloody expensive really fast. So so if you think you're going to record like a whole band, just kind of like, you know, for side audio work, then remember that the audio interface might run you $400, but each microphone is going to cost you like $200. And then you're going to be worrying a lot more about the price of the microphones than the price of the audio interface. So in the case of the audio interface, if you actually are going to be recording live, or not live bands, but if you're going to be recording bands using multiple inputs, then just go overkill. Just buy whatever you feel you could potentially need, and then just because, you know, at that point you're spending a lot of money anyway. So just make sure that you have more than enough so you don't run out of inputs. But that's probably not what most of you guys are going to be doing. So the other case that you would basically want to have more inputs, and that is if you have a whole bunch of synthesizers and you're running them up into your audio interface. You don't want to have to rewire everything when you want to record one of your particular synthesizers. That said, synthesizers are kind of expensive, so you did the same as the case with microphones, buying lots of microphones. You probably won't have a whole bunch of synthesizers lying around, so you'll only need like one or two inputs if you're doing synthesizer inputs. Also, most producers, well, actually, that's a very bad stereotype there. A lot of producers will stick to regular plugins for the most part and not actually have physical synthesizers that they're recording. Just because if you go in and you record a synthesizer, you have to rely on how well you can play it. And while you can like retime it and you can like fix mistakes a little bit, you still have to worry about the fact that there's only so much you can do by editing audio. But when you're keying in notes, you can make the notes as perfect as you want them, and you could just record MIDI notes and reposition them, and then run a digital synthesizer on top of that inside your DAW. So you kind of don't need to worry about having that many inputs for that as well. So it's kind of, you know, basically what I'm saying is most of you guys are just going to need a $100 audio interface. That's just kind of what it boils down to. If you want to do recording for other stuff and you think you will actually need 16 inputs, like you could literally list off what you would use each input for, then it's worth upgrading to a better one. And then once again, it'd be assuming that you actually have a studio and you could set up the entire band that you would be recording in a manner so you don't get tons of terrible bleed. And even then, you might do re-recording of like the guitars or the vocals, for example. Record those separately so that there's no bleeding for those, and only like get the drums or something like that and have that used from the original multi-track recording. So it's really a deal of you're probably not going to need those inputs, and if you are, you shouldn't be watching my video because you should be watching something that's about a lot more expensive gear that is more suited for other styles of music and not EDM. And so the only other reason I would suggest upgrading to a more expensive one is if you have multiple sets of studio monitors, which I know is kind of, is going to be the minority of you are going to have that. I don't think many of you guys will have that. So, so you probably aren't going to need to worry about having multiple studio monitors. But if you do have multiple studio monitors, then you are going to want to get one with enough outputs to cover all those. And once again, remember, outputs are usually counted in mono. So if it says 4 outputs, that means left, right, left, right. So you end up with 4 outputs, technically speaking, but it's only like one set of monitors, another set of monitors. So, but that's the only other reason I'd say to upgrade. So now, the important part. Which brands can you buy from? Now, right off the bat, I can tell you pretty much any brand out there. But if I had to narrow it down, I would say top of the list being Focusrite, just because they're known for having very good sound. Also on the list there, like just the only reason I'm suggesting them is because I've heard they have pretty good sound, and also they're the same price as everyone else. So if you don't know which one to get, just get Focusrite. I mean, what the heck. Then there's a whole bunch of other brands out there. There's M Audio, there is Behringer, PreSonus, Tascam, and then a whole bunch of other ones. Now there's some by, I think it's like UA, which is like Universal Audio. And the problem with them is I think they're insanely expensive, if I recall correctly. And then there's another one which the name slips me. But basically, they make a lot of stuff that that looks sleek and shiny, and it's the price is just insane. So so my personal suggestion is Focusrite, just because they got great audio quality, and they're kind of actually one of those popular ones right now for audio interfaces in general. Now the next one, if I had to choose the next one, would be PreSonus, because they have very good sound as well, and also their preamps are known for being pretty good. For microphones and stuff like that. And then following there, I'd say M Audio and then Behringer. M Audio is, they're pretty good. In my opinion, M Audio is kind of like the catch-all of the audio tech industry, basically. Like, they do studio monitors, they do audio interfaces, they do MIDI controllers, they do tons of stuff. And personally, it kind of feels like they're spread out a bit too much. Like, they have good stuff, don't get me wrong, but I kind of feel if you get more, a piece of equipment from the more specialized groups or the more specialized companies, then you'll kind of get something that's just fine-tuned a bit more. Excuse me, fine-tuned a bit more. So that's kind of why I suggest like Focusrite, the Scarlett series or stuff like that. And then, you know, the one at the bottom is Behringer, just because they make some good stuff and they make some not so good stuff. Essentially, the one thing I've heard about Behringer is it's kind of like a mix of their products being really good for the price and decent. So kind of be careful if you end up looking at Behringer. You can get something dirt cheap from Behringer, probably like what, 40, 60 bucks for an audio interface with everything you need from Behringer. No, it won't be terrible audio quality. Just I personally wouldn't put my money into that because I'd rather spend a little bit more just to get a little bit better quality and kind of be able to trust that it's a little bit more reliable. Like I said, Behringer isn't bad. M Audio, they're not bad at all either. It's just a matter of if you're getting something in the same price range, just my suggestion is go for the ones that are more specialized in that area, like Focusrite and PreSonus. So yeah, the top is suggested there. Just get this Focusrite Scarlett. That lineup is pretty darn good, and I think it's the cheapest one they have is like the 2i2 or something, and that one should have basically everything you need to do some like vocal recording and also have good outputs for your headphones as well as your monitors. And that's pretty much all you need to worry about in an audio interface. So that's just going to be one of the cheaper pieces of gear that you have to get, but it is something that is definitely going to be worlds better than using the headphone jack on your computer. Also, you'll be able to swap between your monitors and your headphones a lot easier than unplugging, replugging, because sometimes you need to be careful about unplugging studio monitors when they're plugged into your computers, because it could get this terrible, nasty, huge explosion pop, and you don't want that. So it's nice to have everything wired up, and then when you just sit down, you kind of just choose, do I want my monitors on or headphones on, and you kind of switch between those, and you don't have to worry about unplugging and replugging everything. So that was pretty much it for this video. You don't have to worry about any specs. It's the easiest video so far in this series. And by way of upgrading this, I don't think you'll ever, once you get a good audio interface, I don't think you'll ever have to upgrade it. You might need to upgrade preamps for your microphones, but that's something that gets into when you're buying like a $500 to $1,000 preamp. Personally, I wouldn't even get a $500 preamp. I would wait until I was ready for a $1,000 preamp. But that's a whole different topic in regards to microphones, and just kind of shows you that, upgrading audio interface is only going to be when you need more inputs or outputs. And that's essentially all it boils down to. So pretty easy topic there. It's kind of like, it feels like this video, personally, it feels like I'm not talking about enough in this video, but really, it's just because it's a simple topic. So that's going to be one of the pieces you need, but you don't need to worry too much about which you get. Just kind of get one that's a good price and has what you need. And then you don't need to worry about audio quality, because essentially all of them are going to have generally the same audio quality. And you'd be very hard pressed to be able to tell whether or not there was actually a difference between the two if you were to listen to both. So anyway, thank you guys so much for watching. I hope this is helpful. Once again, it was a short video, but I hope the content was good enough, and I hope I kind of gave you some just basically name brands that you kind of look for by way of, when you're searching for audio interfaces. There's some other good ones out there as well that I forgot to mention, but I just kind of had the top of my list there, and there's a couple of names that were affordable and also high quality. So anyway, thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.